Welcome to our first official lesson of boot camp. Now I know everybody's really excited to get on with some more animation, but for this first lesson we're going to focus on a really important aspect of creating animation. We're not actually going to be making anything move, but we're going to focus on the issue of posing. Now, just like in sort of more standard motion graphic or motion design animation, your keyframes are kind of your building blocks of your animation. In character animation, it's the key poses that are the building blocks of our animation. And of course, those key poses are going to be made up of many keyframes across all the attributes of the character. But the key poses are vitally important. In fact, it's easy to say that no matter how good your sense of timing is, no matter how well you finesse your movement, if the key poses aren't right, your animation is gonna suck, period. So the key poses are super vital to making sure your animation is strong and works correctly. So we're gonna start here by just creating some different poses, talking about some issues around posing, and we'll use that also as an opportunity to get you guys even more comfortable with working with the rigged puppet. Now, these particular puppets, Squash and Stretch, are unibody characters, so we are limited to some degree in what we can do with the poses. Later on in the course, we'll move on to some more full bipedal character rigs that have a little more ability for some more subtle posing. But this is a perfectly fine way to start the conversation about posing, even with these very simple figures. So let's begin by making a pose as if the character is going to pick something up off the ground. So they're going to be sort of leaning forward, reaching to, say, pick up a penny or something off the ground. And we'll use that to talk about one of the really most vital issues in posing, which is balance. Balance is an really critical aspect of the whole notion of posing because it helps our character have a clear sense of weight and a clear sense of gravity. Now, this is really important in character animation because we're asking our audience essentially to buy into the fact that our character, even if our character is very unrealistic and goofy and abstracted as Squash and Stretch are, and some characters are even more goofy and abstracted than a character like Squash and Stretch, but we're asking our audience to buy into the reality of this character. Now, obviously, no intelligent person believes that this is a real character, but we need our audience to buy into the reality of the character just enough that they give a crap about what happens to them, and they believe that the character is actually a real being in a world that has rules. And for example, when you think about an old Warner Brothers cartoon where Wile E. Coyote would run off of a cliff and then hang in the air for a few seconds before he dropped to the ground, now that gag would not be as funny if we already hadn't bought into the basic reality of the character and the basic reality of the gravity of the world he's living in. Even though that gag belays that reality by having him hang in the air in an unrealistic way, but that gag works because it's working against the reality that we have already bought into. So it's really important that as we pose our character, that we are 100% certain where the weight of the character is, how it is being supported, or how it is being transferred from perhaps one leg to another leg, or maybe just to the ground as the character falls in a heap. But every pose, and I want to make that super clear, every single pose must have a sense of weight and balance, or a clear sense of motivated imbalance. Again, if the character is falling or say maybe pushing up against a heavy object, but we must know as animators, as character animators, we must know where the weight is. That is critically important. So again, let's start with a character reaching forward to pick up something on the ground, and we'll use that to kind of talk about this weight issue a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initially here, I'm going to move my CTI forward 10 frames. And we always want to make sure that we are not posing or corrupting, you could say, our initial row of neutral keyframes at frame 0. I almost always will want to preserve these because even though I can just zero out the values to return to neutral, in a lot of cases it's much faster to just copy and paste, and it allows me to very quickly return individual attributes or indeed the whole figure back to a neutral pose. So we always want to move off that 0 point before we start creating our poses and creating our animation. So I'm moving just 10 frames ahead here. And let's go ahead and set up this pose a little bit. Now, I'm going to start by kind of making a mess of the pose, and then we'll sort of fix it. But I want to give you guys kind of an idea of how you want to be looking out for this weight issue. As the character stands here in neutral, he's obviously well supported by his 2 feet, and the weight is well supported on his legs here. But as we start moving him forward and leaning him forward, that weight is going to begin to shift forward. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to grab the cog here, and I'm just going to start pushing him forward. And again, I'm going to kind of go too far sort of on purpose here. So if we pull him way forward, and then I'm holding down the W key here to rotate his unibody, and then we'll grab his hand and reach that out as if he is reaching to pick something up off the ground. And then I'm gonna move his other hand here, maybe as if he's reaching with both hands, and we'll pull him forward just a little bit more here. Now, another really important thing to remember when you're posing your figure: do not ignore the hands. Make sure the hands are part of the overall gesture of the arm and the pose. And our little hands here, they're fairly limited in their range of motion. They're just little simple mitten hands. So you can't do a whole lot with these little mitten hands without the hands looking a little distorted. And that brings up another good little side issue here that it's probably good to even start addressing right away, which is that every single rig, every puppet you work with is going to have limitations. It's going to have things that it will do well, things that it won't do so well. It'll have ways of posing that will be attractive and ways of posing that will not be attractive. For example, if I bend his thumb way back here, you can see the shape of the hand doesn't look very charming. Now, one solution to this would be go back and re-rig and tweak the character somewhat. But the other way to approach this is just to say, okay, this character just can't bend his thumb back that far. And every character are going to have these sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle limitations on what it can do. One of the first rules you want to remember is work within the limitations of the rig. Don't try to push the rig to do things that it really can't do well or can't do attractively. Err on the side of attractive, charming poses, attractive, charming movement. And you can almost always find a way, even with a very limited rig, you can almost always find a way to get the basic pose you want. It might not be exactly the pose that you have in your head, but it's going to be close. So just always keep that in mind. Pay attention to what the rig does well, what the rig doesn't do well, and work accordingly. Okay, now that we've kind of positioned him here, we should also move his eyes forward so he's looking down where he's going to pick up the coin or whatever it is we're imagining he's going to lean down and pick up here. I'm just going to straighten that hand just a little bit more. Okay, now you can see, or hopefully you can see, and what I want you to start keying into here is if this character was actually in this pose, and he was an actual physical character in gravity, in reality, he would fall over. He would just pitch right over. His weight is much too far forward. Most of the weight is being carried by this front foot, but the bulk of the weight is forward of that foot. So he's not balanced, and he feels as though he's going to fall. Now, it's important to remember, again, as I said before, every pose must feel balanced, because you can't allow anything to belay the reality of your character and the reality of the world they're living in. So it's not even okay to even have one pose that is off balance like this. Every pose must be balanced, or if it is imbalanced, as this is, then you must follow it with what would happen, which is that he would fall. Okay? So if you're putting a character out of balance for a motivated reason, you got to follow through with it and show what would happen if he leaned this far forward, which is that he would tumble right over. So we can easily fix this pose, though, and make it so that he doesn't feel so out of balance. So let's fix this pose, and I think you'll see that we get the same effect of him reaching to pick something up off the ground, but we can restore that sense of reality and that sense of gravity. So let's instead pull him back again. Let's pull that cog backwards. So I'm going to select his arms and the cog here. Whoops. Select his arms and the cog, and we're going to pull him back now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for where the bulk of his weight now begins to be more evenly distributed over those feet. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this other arm back. So I'm going to pull this arm back to counterbalance the weight coming forward. And this is a very natural thing. If you get up and lean forward yourself, you'll probably throw your other arm out to counterbalance, or you'll kind of stick your butt out a little bit to kind of counterbalance. It's a natural occurrence. We automatically try to find equilibrium and balance as we're leaning or reaching. So we'll pull his arm back a little bit here. And now we have a much more balanced pose where he feels as though he's not going to simply fall forward, but he's still able to reach forward and grab whatever it is that he's picking up on the ground there. We might exaggerate that just a little bit. And we can push the pose as well to exaggerate it as much as possible. And that's another really important aspect of posing, is when you start to build your poses, always try to push the pose as far as you can while still maintaining the balance. You don't want to push it off balance, but you want to make it as extreme as you can, as strong and definite, so that when your audience looks at the pose, there's absolutely no doubt in their mind what is happening with this pose. He is reaching down to the ground to pick something up. So this pose is looking much, much better. That's feeling a lot stronger, feeling a lot more balanced, and now he has a clear sense of weight, and there's a clear sense of gravity working on the character in the world he's living in. Okay, let's do another pose and play with some other aspects of balance. So I'm going to jump forward here another 10 frames. And let's do sort of a action pose, like he's got a sword or he's got a tennis racket. He's playing tennis, let's say. And so we get kind of an action-y pose. So the first thing I'm going to do is reset this pose to neutral. Now, you don't necessarily in every case have to completely reset to neutral before you create a new pose, but it's often a very smart way to work, especially if the pose is going to be fairly different from the pose that you are starting with. If you're creating simply a variation on a pose, then you can maybe just tweak the pose you've got and just tweak it a little bit to create a little subtle variation. But in this case, we're going to create a kind of a completely different pose. So I want to reset him to neutral. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select and copy and paste the neutral keyframes on any of the attributes that we have currently manipulated here. So I'm just going to run down the row and just copy and paste those, and boom, that snaps him back into his neutral, and now we can sort of begin again. So let's start by having him kind of crouch down a little bit here. And we're going to lean him forward a little bit again, not as much as before. And then I'm going to pull his arm out here as if he's got like a tennis racket or a sword in his hand or something. And to make this a little bit stronger, I'm also going to move his shoulder a little bit. With these unibody characters, particularly squash and stretch that have very large unibodies, having some ability to move the shoulder is really critical in order to make our poses a little more clear. So I'm going to pull this shoulder forward a little bit here. That way I can get this arm out a little bit more and get it pulled out from behind his unibody just a little bit more. Okay, so this pose it's balanced and it's working okay. But again, I want to push this pose. I want to make this pose just a little more dramatic. And the balance is fine, but if he's kind of leaning forward here with his racket or with a sword, I think for an action pose, we would want to counterbalance that even a little bit more, even though our balance isn't bad here. But we can make it a little bit stronger. And if I just start to lean him forward, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll lean him forward a little bit more here. Now we start to drift out of balance, and now we've lost some of our balance, but the pose is starting to be a little bit stronger. So what I need to do is I need to pull this foot out to catch this extra weight now that's coming forward. What we did with the previous pose was we kind of just leaned him back, but what if I definitely want him leaned more forward? In that case, rather than pulling him back on his cog, on his center of gravity, I'm instead going to pull this foot. Whoops, I got the other arms selected there. I instead want to pull this foot forward. And in fact, I'm going to pull it forward quite a bit so we get this kind of sense that he's ready for action. He's got his wide stance. He's got a really good, strong center of gravity here. His gravity is well supported by the feet spread out. And now he's really ready for action. He's ready for his tennis game. He's ready for his sword fight. And I'm also going to maybe exaggerate this arm and pull this up just a little bit as well. And now we've got a much stronger kind of action pose. And again, we were able to get him to lean forward. In fact, he can lean forward even more. I'm probably well within balance through this whole range, partly because I've got his legs spread wide there, giving him that wide stance, that wide base for his weight. So that gives us a much more fun, much more dynamic kind of action pose there. And he's ready to leap into the fray. I'm also still going to move his eyes. Don't forget about the eyes. It's always a good way to really help indicate where the character's attention is, what the character's motivations are, potentially an emotional state. And even though we have sort of limited posing on the eyes here, just taking a little time to make sure that he's looking in the direction that he should be looking, or he's using his eyes to help direct the viewer towards what we should be looking at, and so on. So don't forget about the eyes as well. Okay, so this pose is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and move on and create a slightly more tricky pose where we're balancing on a single foot. That can be a little more difficult in creating a sense of balance. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to jump ahead again 10 frames. And now we're going to once again return him to neutral. So again, I'm going to copy and paste my neutral keyframes on all the attributes that we have manipulated so far here. And After Effects makes this easy by highlighting the attributes that have been keyframed there. Okay. All right, so we return to neutral. Okay, so let's now do a little pose as if he's waving to the audience. But we'll have him go up on one foot, so it's a real strong, like woohoo, like a signal, like I'm signaling from a hilltop, waving across a crowded room, or waving from a hilltop or something like that. So what we're going to do first is we'll lift this leg off the ground just to get started here a little bit. And you can see right away that we've already got some balance problems just by lifting that foot off the ground. His body weight is already way too far forward here in order to make this pose feel balanced. So almost as soon as we lift that foot off the ground, almost immediately we want to start thinking about pulling that cog back so that we once again return the bulk of the weight over the one foot that remains to support it. Then we can go ahead and start posing our arms here. And just like we did before, I want to manipulate the shoulder here so I get a little clearer view of the arm, so the arm isn't so hidden behind his body. So we're going to move the shoulder up quite substantially here, and then that will help support the wave, and it'll also make sure that we can actually see the arm out from behind his body. Let's also tilt him back a little bit here to also accentuate that wave. So by tilting him back, we raise his shoulder by just twisting the whole, rotating the whole unibody, and then we also are going to raise the shoulder here also with the shoulder control so that arm is really far up. Okay, this is looking pretty good. I still need to bring him back a little bit though. He's still a little too much weight forward here. So I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to rotate him a little bit more. That's going to start pulling that weight back a little bit. And then I'm still going to bring him back a little bit more. So again, the bulk of that weight is centered over the foot that's taking the weight. Okay, that's looking better there. And I want to make sure that the arms and the hands are posed well. And let's pull this back a little bit. Okay, and then let's have him look at the camera just a little bit more. So I'm just going to pull the eyes back just a tad so he has a little more of a feeling that he's looking right at us, looking right at the camera there. And there we have a nice kind of very excited wave. That's working pretty nice. Now also don't forget about the toe adjustments here. I have this foot up in the air, and it's okay to leave that toe straight, but it might be nice to just give it a tiny bit of curvature there. Just soften that just a little bit. I think that makes that pose feel just a bit stronger. Okay, so we've got 3 nice poses here now, and if I use my J and K keys to flip through them here, of course we'll have to reposition in our window. You can see that in each case we have a clear sense of weight and a clear sense of balance. That is so critical. And on all these poses we understand where the weight is, and we understand how the weight is being supported and how the weight is being balanced or counterbalanced in order to make those poses feel like they exist in a world with gravity, and that our character is a real physical being in that world. So that's that important balance issue. Okay, the next thing that we want to talk about is silhouette. And silhouettes are also very important for making your poses visually appealing and communicative. If your silhouette is not clear on your pose and your silhouette isn't attractive, your movement is going to be less attractive and less charming. So I'm going to kind of take these poses here and we're just going to goof with them a little bit so we can kind of see the difference. But let's actually turn this to a silhouette so we can really kind of see what we're doing. So I've got an adjustment layer here. So I'm going to first toggle off my background, toggle to the transparency grid here. And then I'm going to turn on this adjustment layer that's going to knock our character to a pure silhouette. Now I want you to notice as we look at these 3 poses, I want you to notice that I can still completely read what's happening in these poses. He's leaning down to pick something up. He's holding a tennis racket or a sword ready for battle. He's waving to us from a hilltop. Okay, this is very important. Your poses should 100% read at the level of a silhouette without any additional detail. We should still be able to see what the character's doing clearly, and there should be a sense of charm and interest to the pose. So let's look at some bad things that we can do with our silhouette so we understand what the good things are. So one of the first things that we always want to think about when we are thinking about silhouette is making sure that the limbs are clear and that the limbs are easy to see and understand. So one of the things we did as we were creating these poses was we moved the shoulder around so that these arms were more clear and clear from the unibody. So let's kind of see what happens when we lose that. Oh, so I got to lock my silhouette layer there. Okay, so if I actually pulled this shoulder back, let's put this shoulder back at 0 and then readjust this pose. You can see right away that that is not as strong a silhouette because I can't see much more of the arm than the forearm and the hand. I'm missing a lot of information about this arm. And by pulling that shoulder up so I can see both the upper arm and the lower arm, I get a much clearer silhouette on that arm and a much clearer view of the pose. The other thing that we want to avoid is we want to avoid clumping our limbs over each other or over the body. So for example, if I took this arm here and I moved it into a position like so, rather than the position it was in, you can see right away my silhouette is much less clear. It's also less charming. It's not as pleasant to look at, and I can't really see what's happening. And we can mess this up further if I start to clump the body, the legs on top of one another. I got to pull that weight back there. We'll still keep him balanced, but notice how much we've lost from the original pose. We've lost clarity, we've lost charm, and this pose is not nearly as strong as it was when the silhouette was much stronger. So we want to think about how that silhouette is reading, and we want to make corrections to make sure that our silhouettes read clearly and feel stronger. So I'm going to actually undo back, and as we undo back, let's notice how much clearer and how much more charming this pose becomes once we return it to its original state. Okay, now I can see all the limbs, I can see what's happening, I have even a sense of the emotion and the feeling of the pose, all simply through silhouette. I really recommend using an adjustment layer. If you're struggling with this issue, use an adjustment layer and knock your character to a silhouette and check your poses and look for opportunities to clarify, to avoid that clumping, and to make sure that you can see what each limb is doing and you can really see the pose in that silhouette. Now, another issue that we want to think about with silhouettes is symmetry. So I'm going to jump ahead another 10 frames here, and let's also reset him to neutral. Okay, so now we have our character at his neutral pose here. And another important issue when you're thinking about silhouette is avoiding symmetry. And it's really easy to sort of fall into symmetry when you're posing a character without even necessarily meaning to. So let's look at that situation as well. So I'm going to do a little sort of crouch pose here. So I'm going to have him kind of crouch down a little bit, and then we'll pull his arms out to the side, sort of like he's getting ready to do a jump or landing after a jump. Now, what we want to do here, I'm going to sort of purposefully make this pose very symmetrical. And what I want you to do is recognize the stiffness that starts to take place once we start to get that silhouette. I'm going to reverse the IK orientation on this hand here. Okay, and pull both these arms up. And let's pull that shoulder out just a little bit more. Okay, so now we have a reasonable crouching pose with his arms up. But notice that with that perfect symmetry, we get a lot of stiffness. It starts to feel very flat. The character starts to go very two-dimensional. And again, we lose a sense of charm, a sense of dynamics when we get into this kind of perfect symmetry. So when you're building a pose, if you find yourself kind of running into symmetry, and it happens a lot when you're just kind of freely posing along, you'll often sort of stumble into symmetry without even realizing you're doing it. It's a really common thing. And I think it's partly because just we as humans, we sort of crave symmetry to a certain degree. So you're going to find yourself doing this without always thinking about it. So what we want to do is we want to look for small ways we can introduce a little asymmetry. So a really easy way with a unibody character is just to rotate the body a little bit, just a little bit, and right away we start to lose some of that perfect symmetry. And then I'm also going to grab the arms here, and I'm going to look for small ways that I can introduce a little asymmetry into the arms. So maybe this one is a little lower, and this one is a little higher, just a little bit, just throwing a small amount of asymmetry in there. Suddenly now the pose feels far less flat, feels a little more dimensional. There's more of a sense of dynamics and energy to the pose just by introducing a little bit of asymmetry. So keep an eye out for that as well. And once again, if it helps you to have an adjustment layer to really focus on the silhouette, do it. It's a great technique, especially when you're beginning and you're not maybe as used to kind of visualizing the pose as a silhouette. So avoiding clumping, making sure your pose reads clearly as a silhouette, and then making sure you always introduce a little bit of asymmetry, and when possible, a lot of asymmetry into the pose. We usually want to try to build in as much asymmetry as we possibly can. All right, let's move on and look at another very important aspect of posing, and that is lines of action. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my silhouette here, and let's turn on the background here so we can kind of focus on the character more normally here. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead here another 10 frames, and we're going to once again return our character to his neutral pose here. And the next thing we want to talk about is lines of action and building your poses along strong lines of action. This is another really critical aspect of good quality posing. And the idea here is that we want to build our poses around simple, clear lines that we sort of imagine passing through the figure. And it's as if we, in the old days when we hand drew our animation, we would actually sketch in loose, rough lines and then build the poses around those lines. We still want to think that way even working with a rigged puppet. So let's do a pose of the character reaching upwards as if he's going to pull something off of a shelf, and we'll use that to kind of talk about creating strong lines of action. So let's begin setting up this pose. The first thing I'm going to do is lean the cog back a little bit here so he is leaning upwards. And then I'm also going to pull one of the feet back here so he's kind of balancing himself, balancing his weight off the back there. And then we're going to lift this arm here. This is going to be the arm we're going to lift up to grab the thing off the shelf or whatever we're going to have him doing here. So let's put that arm out, and I'm going to lift the shoulder once again, pull that shoulder up so we can lift up fairly high. We might even bring the shoulder out a little bit more. There we go. Okay, now right away I want to start thinking about my lines of action here with this pose. He's leaning forward, and so I want to create a flow all the way through the body that moves basically from this back leg up through that arm. And then I want to kind of align the whole pose kind of along that broad line that I'm imagining moving through his body here. So let's do that. So there's a couple things we can do. For one thing, I want to lean him forward a little bit so that maybe the back leg is just slightly bent, but the front leg can be fairly straight. I don't want it too bent there. One thing you want to be very cautious of as you're working with the legs is you want to make sure you're aware of the point at which the IK begins to bend the leg and the point at which the leg goes straight. And we want to be sure we're not really cranking on that and like stretching them way out of proportion. Not only does that kind of break the look and style of the character, but it will also cause problems in your in-betweening because your knees will pop at places that you don't intend them to. So we always want to be cautious to go just to the point of straightening, but not a whole lot farther than that, so we're not grossly stretching those legs too much. So here we've got now both of the legs are now kind of more aligned with this overall line of action we're trying to create here. And then I want to kind of connect that with this arm here. So I'm going to pull back a little. I'm going to pull this arm down a little bit. And I'm even going to reverse the IK here just a little bit so I get just a little bit of curvature. I'm going to use the nudge keys here. When you want a real fine tuning, a little bit of nudging really helps. Okay, so again, we're kind of creating this flow, this subtle sense of an arc. That's maybe a little too much bend there. Okay, I guess I like the straighter arm a little bit better there. And again, this is part of posing. You're going to try things and fuss with things and go back and forth. So, but again, I want this strong sense that everything in the body is kind of aligned along this line, and I want that to continue even with this back arm. So I'm going to straighten this back arm. I don't need to straighten it all the way, but I want to make it now part of this overall line of action through the body. And I also don't want to forget about the eyes. I want the eyes to also participate in that. And so now we have a very clear line of action moving through this body. Everything is kind of pitched along this arc, moving from the back foot to the hand. And not only does that make the whole energy of the pose feel very strong, it makes the pose feel very organized, that everything in the pose is all working towards this one goal. And the other thing it's doing for us is it's focusing our audience's attention on where he is about to pick something up off the shelf. The eyes, the limbs, everything is essentially pointing us to this place. So it's also serving to draw the eye directly to that spot. So that's how we want to be thinking about lines of action, and there should really only be one or two lines of action that most poses are built around. If you can kind of keep it down to kind of one or two simple, strong lines that carry through the figure, your poses are going to feel very organized, very clear, and very strong. So let's go back through our previous poses and let's improve our lines of action, because we built those pretty fast. And I think we can probably go through and pick out some lines of action and strengthen them a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back to this pose here. And I think what we want to do here is create a line that kind of sweeps through, a kind of a bent line that kind of sweeps through the body. And I think we can also push this pose a little bit. This will also be a good way to look at how we can push poses. This pose is pretty good, but let's push it. And by push it, I mean maintain the same pose, but exaggerate everything we can exaggerate without breaking the essential nature of the pose. So for one thing, I'm going to bring them down much lower here. Let's start with that. And then what I want to do is I want to really focus on connecting and aligning these arms. Ooh, that one kind of fell together just about perfectly there. So the flow of this arm carries through the body, picks up with this arm, and carries right out the other side. And I don't want to forget about the hands either. I want to make sure the hands are also continuing that shape and that arc. So we have a strong line curving through there. We can maybe push this pose even more by introducing a small amount of squash to his body here. So we'll squash him down a little. It just caused me to very gently pull out these arms just a little bit. And now we have a stronger line of action running through this pose, and our pose has been pushed. It's been exaggerated a little farther, so it is a stronger and more dynamic pose. Okay, let's go back and look at this one here. This one's working pretty good, but I want to maybe try to create a little bit of a stronger line of action from this foot curving up through that arm there. So let's maybe pull him back even just a teeny bit more, pull his weight back just a little bit more on that foot. And then I want to really think about trying to connect this arm with the line being created by starting with the base of the foot here. And I'm going to use this second foot to really kind of push that line of action. So I'm going to bend that toe a little more. So this is kind of all aligned along this basic flow. And then we can kind of pick that up with this back arm too and get that feeling a little more in line with our overall flow. And maybe I'll pull his little hand out there to kind of pick up on that that direction and that energy a little bit. Okay. All right, so now we've got a little bit of a stronger pose here as well. I might rotate him even a little bit more. Let's just rotate him a little bit more. Yeah, that feels even better. And again, the rotation of the body now is picking up on this overall curvature and this overall flow through the pose. Let's check this one here. This one, I think we want to create a strong arc forward here. And we've basically got that. We've sort of got an S curve happening with our arms here. That's working pretty well. But I think we could push it just a little bit more. Let's kind of push the pose a little. We'll maybe have him crouch just a little bit more. And even by crouching, we're bringing this knee up into the body a little more. We're connecting a little more with the flow through that body. And I think what we want to do is soften the arc on this back arm here and make that a little bit straighter. And let's straighten out that hand a little. So now we kind of accentuate that kind of smooth S curve running right through the body. This one was in pretty good shape to start with, so we didn't have to do a whole lot there. But that still looks a little bit stronger, just a little bit cleaner. And then our reaching down pose, this one's also already looking pretty good. And here, this is our line of action, this kind of curved down arc here. And I think we're hitting this pretty good. I think if I was going to do anything, I would maybe pull the shoulder out a little bit so we get a little stronger silhouette on this back arm. And then maybe straighten that and straighten out the hand. So again, the hand is carrying that line through. So now from the fingertips all the way through, we're curving right through there, and we have just a little bit of a stronger line of action through there. Again, this one was already in pretty good shape when we started. So now all of our poses have good balance. They have strong communicative silhouettes. And oops, we have to reverse our IK here on this arm here. That got lost in one of our tweaks. I don't know quite what happened here. We somehow lost something with that pose. There we go. Bring that back a little bit. I think we must have changed something early on that shifted what we were doing here. So all of our poses, once again, they're all balanced. They all have strong communicative silhouettes, and they're all built along clear lines of action. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about is building a sense of expression and performance into your posing. Now, all these things we've been talking about are really the core kind of technical aspects of building a good, strong pose. And especially when you're just starting, those should really be your primary focus. Make sure you're getting that balance, those silhouettes, those lines of action. But we also want to focus on what we're really trying to do as character animators, which is we're trying to create a believable performance from a character that lives and breathes for our audience. Our audience has to believe that this character is alive, even if they only believe it in the abstract. But we need that. Communication from our audience. So I'm going to just do a couple of more expressive poses here, and we just want to talk to you guys and have you guys start to think about how your poses can also convey emotion and mood. So let's jump ahead another 10 frames here. And let's reset to our neutrals. Oops, almost forgot that squash and stretch there. Make sure we get all the attributes that have been manipulated. Okay, so let's create a sad pose. Let's pretend our character is meant to be sad and despondent. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get up out of my chair and I'm going to be sad and despondent. Your very, very best reference for performance, you are living in your own body. You're performing through your character, but you have the best reference possible in that you are living in a body that can perform. So get up and perform. Try acting out what it is you're trying to animate. It's a tremendously helpful way to work. So when I am feeling sad, and I imagine you too, I droop, I drop, my shoulders come down, my head looks down. I'm not going to have a spring in my step. I'm not going to hold myself tall and erect. My muscles are going to be loose. My arms are going to sort of dangle and drag and so forth. So let's try to build that in. Just make a very, very simple pose here that expresses sadness. So I'm going to start by having him look down a little bit. That's our first thing here. And we'll do that with both the movement of his body, and we'll also have his eyes look down. And I might also close the eyes part way, almost as if they're half lidded there a little bit. And then I want to pull him back because I've leaned him forward just a little bit for balance here. And then I want to bring him down so that the knees are bent slightly. Because again, if I'm sad, I'm not going to stand up straight and tall. I'm going to slump. I'm going to droop, right? And then I want the arms to simply dangle, and I'm going to bring them down. I'm going to bring the shoulders down because your shoulders will also droop if you are sad or depressed. Now here I'm getting a little convergence here between the knee and the hand. This is a perfect opportunity to use our shoulder control to kind of pull this out. Oh, it also looks like I didn't quite zero out this value here. Let's zero that out. And I want to make sure that by cheating that little shoulder forward, I lose that little convergence there. So this arm is kind of drooping and dangling. I might want to put a little bit of a bend in the arm. I'm going to use the nudge keys to do that here. So the arm is dangling, but it's dangling loosely, and it's again not held taut with muscles taut. And then with this arm, we want to do the same thing. I'm going to bring the shoulder down, let that arm just kind of dangle with just a little bit of a bend in the elbow. Again, we'll use the nudge keys here to just fine-tune that a little bit. Okay, so his mood here is definitely somber. He's looking down. I might have him look down even more. He is drooping and dropping. There's no sense of tension in the muscles. The muscles are loose and weak as he just kind of hangs there. So we definitely have kind of a moody, somber feeling to this pose. So let's create the opposite now. Let's create a happy pose. So I'm going to jump forward here 10 frames. And again, we're going to copy and paste our neutral values back. And now let's see if we can make him feel a little happier. So first thing I'm going to do is now raise his head a little bit rather than look his head down. And I'm going to pull this leg back. It's okay that this knee is bent, but I'm going to pull this leg back just so that knee goes a little bit straighter, because part of the happiness is going to be that he has a little more energy. He has a little more dynamism running through his body. So his muscles are more taut. He's holding himself up high. He's holding himself in a more positive kind of way. And then let's just really sell this happiness pose, and we'll actually bring his hands up in kind of a hooray kind of a posture here. So it's like he's cheering or something like that. And this is also part of the game here, is that if you want a character to feel happy, make him really happy. Exaggeration, remember, is one of our animation principles, is exaggeration. And we want to exaggerate our poses, push our poses, exaggerate the poses to make them as happy, if we want happy, as we possibly can, or conversely as sad or as mad, or whatever emotion we're trying to convey. We want to make sure that we give it that, push it as far as we can go. So he's not just happy, he's ecstatic. He's not just sad, he's at death's door, okay? So just always try to kind of push on those poses. And then even raising his hand up a little here, raising his eyes up a little here will help give him a little brighter, happier look. And I'm going to stretch the eyes out just a little to kind of open them up just a little bit there. So there we have a much happier pose. It's filled with energy. He sort of looks like he's cheering, or about to jump for joy or something like that. And note that with both of these poses, now let's go between them here. So here's happy and sad. Happy and sad. Okay? So very, very clear communication of these emotions between these two poses. It's as clear as night and day that this is a happy guy and this is a sad guy right here. And I want you to note as well, I'm going to turn on my transparency grid and we're going to toggle that silhouette on here. I also want you to notice that it reads as happy and sad even in silhouette. And that gets us back to that idea of your silhouette being clear and communicative. We can see that he's happy, we can see that he's sad, even though we cannot see his face. And even when we can see his face, he has almost no expressive ability. We don't have eyebrows, we can't change his mouth, all we can do is move his eyes around, and yet we still feel the sadness and the happiness even without those facial expressions. And that's really important to remember. When you get a character rig that has a very expressive face, it's easy to just rely on a frown or a smile to convey happy or sad. But it's not going to communicate as strongly unless the whole body is involved in that expression. The whole figure should say sad. The whole figure should say happy, not just the face. That's going to make your animation communicate so much better, and it's going to really, really improve the performance of your character as well. Okay, I hope this has helped you guys learn a little bit about posing and get a little more comfortable working with the puppet. Move on to the evaluation exercise and see what we have set up for you there. What we have is a pose off between squash and stretch.